Well, hi there! This delightful blob of a frog is a Pac-Man frog. If you're familiar with Pac-Man, then that name probably doesn't require much explanation. But it's basically a circle with a giant mouth. And it does have some frog legs, but they aren't really proportionate to that body. Also called South American horned frogs because they're from South America and have horn-like projections over their eyes. And those horn-like projections are one of the easiest ways to differentiate them from their African doppelgangers, the pixie frogs or African bullfrogs, that we covered a couple of years ago. And in case you've been wondering how Boxhead has been doing, I can tell you that she's doing great, especially since we upgraded her to this Tarantula cribs enclosure. We'll talk more about those later, because today the time has come to discuss this frog, the South American horned frog, and determine if it's a good pet, and if it's the best pet giant fat froggy for you. Which means that we'll have to give it a score based on our 5 categories, which are handleability, care, hardiness, availability, and upfront costs. When it comes to handleability, no amphibian is going to get a 5. Amphibians have highly permeable skin, which means that whatever gets onto their skin can easily enter into their bodies. This includes chemicals and pathogens from your skin. So if you're going to handle them, you should probably wear gloves. And that applies to pretty much all amphibians. Delightfully, most amphibians are not capable of scratching you and don't have a nasty bite. And frogs cannot drop the tails that they've already resorbed. This particular frog is also not very capable of jumping away, as their legs are disproportionately dainty. That said, their mouths are disproportionately large. Their appetites are disproportionately optimistic, and so they might try to eat you from time to time. And when this happens, the bite is probably about as bad as any frog bite out there. They have big, nasty, sharp teeth on top and a bony projection at the front of their lower jaw. They can make you bleed for sure. And they often have difficulty releasing things that they bite, even when they discover that it's too big to swallow. So you might be dealing with those teeth and bone spikes for considerably longer than you would find to be ideal. It's not going to kill you or anything, but I mean, you'll probably end up telling people about it. And you might have a little scar to show them if they were incredulous about how intense your frog bite really was. So handling them can be dangerous for them and a little bit dangerous for you as well. But if you have gloves and avoid putting yourself in a position where you might look like food, it really isn't crazy difficult to handle them, and we give them a 3. When it comes to care, we give the Pac-Man frog a score of 4 out of 5. The enclosure that you need does not need to be huge. These can be very large frogs, actually even considerably bigger than this one. This one's still fairly young. But they don't move around very much. They just sit in one place, often largely buried in the substrate, and just wait for food to pass by. And if you combine that knowledge with a knowledge of the fact that, well, these are amphibians and carnivores, that'll tell you most of what you really need to know. The enclosure doesn't need to be super large for such a large animal. I keep my African bullfrog in this enclosure from Tarantula cribs, and I can scarcely imagine a better type of enclosure for a Pac-Man frog. These enclosures are going to maintain temperature and humidity much better than glass, and the variety of different lid options will allow you to figure out just how much ventilation is ideal to maintain the correct parameters for your frog in your home. Though glass enclosures can work as well. But do be sure to have a secure lid. These guys are not notorious climbers, but frogs in general, they're just damp enough to be very grippy. And if they ever do get out, they'll dry out pretty quickly outside of your enclosure. Inside the enclosure, though, they need substrate that can be continuously damp, but not really wet. Eco-earth or something similar is a great option, perhaps with a bit of moss mixed in. A water bowl is also a good idea, though arguably not necessary as long as the substrate is properly damp. That said, I provide one for my African bullfrog, and I would do the same for a Pac-Man frog. They will make use of other bits of cover they can hide under as well. Make sure that you do not use tap water to mist or in their water bowls. And remember, any chemicals will make their way into the frog. It's an amphibian. As an amphibian, they do not need the elevated temperatures needed by many reptiles. Extremely high temperatures will kill them very quickly. Right around room temperature is generally fine. In the neighborhood of 23 to 24 degrees Celsius is great. That's like low to mid 70s Fahrenheit. If your house isn't way below that, I wouldn't use heat. If you do need to use heat, be exceedingly careful. Again, too much is far more dangerous than slightly too little. But if your frog isn't eating, it might mean that it's a bit too cold. When it comes to food, generally they love it. They will eat any animal that can fit into their mouths or that they think they can fit into their mouths. And that can include other frogs, even slightly larger frogs. So how's them alone? They will eat everything from small insects, to fish, to worms, to mammals. Make sure to vitamin and calcium dust your insects. And variety is probably what's best. They don't need to eat a ton, but you will need to provide food probably at least weekly and maybe more often when they're young. Really just keep an eye on their body condition and increase or decrease your feeding schedule accordingly. It's not the easiest pet possible, but it isn't rocket surgery. There are even pre-formulated diets that you can give them off tongs, like Hikari Pack Attack. And so if you don't want to feed insects all of the time, you may not have to. When it comes to hardiness, let me put it to you this way. Most frogs live for only a few years and they die if things dry out. Pac-man frogs, on the other hand, live longer than most dogs and can encase themselves in a protective coating and brumate for extended periods of time if conditions get rough. This is actually another way that they're very similar to African bullfrogs, despite not being closely related to African bullfrogs. This is as hardy as a frog is going to get. African bullfrogs get a 5 for hardiness, and I would give Pac-man frogs the same score, but I do have a serious reservation. If we were talking about F1 or F2 individuals, I would give them a 5 without any real reservations. But we aren't talking about wild-type frogs bred from healthy stock. In most cases, we're talking about morph individuals that have been line-bred or otherwise are highly inbred for many generations. And the thing is that inbreeding doesn't cause mutations to occur, but it does increase the likelihood of homozygosity, or having 2 of the same allele for a given gene. This is usually what you want when you're breeding for specific colors and patterns, especially when those colors and patterns are recessive. But doing this for multiple generations often has the effect of not only increasing homozygosity in the genes that you're targeting, but also in other genes that you aren't. And there are many alleles that are devastating to have in the homozygous condition. So deformities, genetic illnesses, and shorter lifespans are not uncommon among highly inbred populations. And this is often the case with Pac-man frogs. Many breeders are not paying attention to anything but appearance. And as a result, they're producing beautiful, unusual little frogs with a host of problems. And many people discover this to be the case far too late when their beautiful baby frog fails to thrive and dies prematurely. Because this is so common in Pac-man frogs, I cannot give them a 5 like their African alternatives. Though if you get one from a reputable breeder that regularly outcrosses their lines and focuses on more than aesthetic, then you could get yourself a Pac-man 5. But overall, we're going to give them a 3. When it comes to availability, Pac-man frogs are one of the most common frogs around, so they get a 5. But I would actually be very careful about where I got one. You want to get one from a good breeder. So I wouldn't buy one from most pet shops. I would get one directly from a breeder either at an expo or online, and I would ask a lot of questions first. I think most good breeders will appreciate that you value what they're doing, and the bad breeders will probably be pretty annoyed that you're asking so many questions. Good breeders will be excited to tell you what they're doing to diversify their bloodlines and ensure the genetic health of the frogs that they produce. Bad breeders will not. It's also helpful to ask around within the community to find out which breeders people recommend. This is all good practice for any animal, but particularly relevant here. So they get a 5. If you want a Pac-man frog, just any Pac-man frog, it won't be hard to find. But functionally, it might be more like a 3. You might need to dig to find a Pac-man frog that you would really want to buy from a breeder that you would really want to support. When it comes to upfront costs, we give the Pac-man frog a score of 5 out of 5. Like most frogs, Pac-man frogs are very fecund. This means that even good breeders that practice responsible and ethical breeding still produce huge numbers of these frogs. And so prices, even from good breeders, are pretty darn reasonable. Maybe not as much if you want a really rare color, but if you just want a Pac-man frog, you can have one for very cheap. The enclosure, like what you might get from Tarantula cribs, is also not very expensive. You'll need substrate, a bowl, calcium and vitamin supplements, but all of this is very reasonable. You may not need any heat source, but if you do, it shouldn't be expensive, but a thermostat to prevent overheating is a valuable idea. This is not an expensive pet. Now, tarantula cribs obviously makes incredible enclosures for smaller frogs, like the Pac-Man frog that we're talking about today. What if you've got a bigger reptile or amphibian that you'd like to keep in an enclosure that's just as nice? Well, now Tarantula Cribs has got your back, because they have been working on some much larger and truly glorious, not that all their enclosures aren't glorious, but I love this thing. Look at these new enclosures. Just like before, you can switch out the acrylic top for the screen top, so if you need to have a basking light or you need a little less humidity, you can get all of that dialed in. I love the curvature. In general, I don't really like bow front aquaria because they kind of distort things inside, but I love this bend because it's going to allow you to look in from above, look in from the front. Can you imagine putting some dart frogs in something like this? It's epic! 33 gallons from Tarantula Cribs. They're not just spectacular tarantula enclosures anymore. And look at this. They've got built-in places for you to put a fogger. They've got built-in drain plugs. This has everything you could possibly want, even for a pretty good size amphibian, and many reptiles as well. I'm so excited that Tarantula Cribs is the sponsor of today's video because these are genuinely the most beautiful acrylic enclosures I've ever seen. They use powerful magnets that prevent any sort of escapes. It's a work of art in your home. I can scarcely imagine a better enclosure for a Pac-Man frog, and who knows what you'll use it for. So check out our link down in the description, and if you use our code Clint10 when you check out, you'll save 10% off your order. Now let's get back to Pac-Man frogs. And this is why, overall, we give the Pac-Man frog a score of 4.0 out of 5. This is really a very reasonable little monster. If what you want is a blob of a frog that eats any animal it can swallow and that can swallow animals its own size, then you have a tough choice. Because you could get an African bullfrog and be very happy indeed. But if it has to have horns, or come in spectacular colors, or be from South America, then the Pac-Man frog might just be the best pet amphibian for you. As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon. I just want to say thank you to all of these people. As you know, our pet videos are not our most popular videos, especially about things like frogs. But we really feel like this library is important, and it's not done. And it's because of the support of these people that we can continue to make videos that we know won't make a lot of revenue for us, but that we just feel are needed. So thank them, and maybe consider joining them.
How's your stomach feeling?
Good.
I couldn't help but notice
the constant noises that are being made from up here?
Yeah.
It's weird.
Flatulence, yeah.
Something like that. Between the gloves and the frog, it's a lot. It conceals many sins.
Yeah, you're blaming it on the gloves. Yes.
And the frog.
And the frog, sure. But we all know what's really happening.
Fart jokes, Jason.
Fart jokes.
Fart jokes.
Fart jokes. That's what I'm, yeah.
That's what he's known for. That's what makes him irreplaceable.